Okay, we're back here to talk about organizational change during your D365 transformation. So this is Eric Kimberling you may remember me from yesterday. I actually started my career as a change management consultant. So this topic is something that's near and dear to my heart. Back in the 90s when I first started at one of the big system integrators, it was change management that I was first doing for the first couple of years of my career. That was my focus before broadening to get into more process reengineering and project management and software selection and some of the other stuff that I've done here over the years. So what we're going to talk about today is a high-level framework for managing change in your organization. We want to talk a little bit about some of the risks that come along with these types of transformations and talk about how these change tool sets can fit in with the SureStep methodology and augment what you're already doing on the more technical and functional side of the D365 transformation, assuming that you're using SureStep or some methodology similar to SureStep. So the agenda for today, we'll first get into an intro to organizational change. What exactly does it mean? It's a pretty broad term that can be interpreted a number of different ways. So we'll talk about what change management means, and then we'll get into the change management tool set and talk a little bit about the different tools that we typically recommend clients use during their transformations. And then talk about when change management should occur in D365 transformation. And then time permitting, we'll get into a few examples and case studies. But if we don't have time, we'll cut that section, and we have some detailed slides that you'll have access to that outline some of those case studies, because we'll want to make sure we limit this session to about 45 minutes. So we have 45 minutes for another 45 minutes for the last session of the boot camp, which is lessons from D365 and ERP failures. So I guess just before we start diving into the materials, I want to open it up to the phone line here and just see what your guys' feedback is on just with your teams, your organization you're at now, or maybe your own personal experience with past transformations. You know, what has your personal or group team experience been with past transformations as far as how people have adopted to the change? You know, has it gone well? Has it been a problem? Have you had challenges? Why don't I leave it at that and see what questions or comments or see what comments you guys have. Anyone's free to chime in here, even if everything's gone great or you don't have anything to add to it. I'd just be curious to hear the take from people on the phone here.
Yeah, one thing, but at a very abstract level, I can tell that new roles or new work makes people really scared, skeptic, and distant from what is this. So they would like to go back to what they were doing before. So this was not their role before, and suddenly the changes have brought in some new things that they are supposed to do, and their role itself has completely transformed into something else. Causes a lot of fear, and the fear of failure, unknown, they don't know how to succeed. Lack of experience in that role or understanding of that role causes a lot of trouble in making the team work with the transformative process.
Right. So there's fear, there's change. Those are good ones. What else? I think a couple of you look like we're about to chime in.
For us, having walked through the POS implementation, and we did the implementation readiness with you guys, so we definitely got some good feedback there. What was identified in that process, we do have a high trust internally in the company. But I think as we walked out the POS project, what actually rose to the top was that we did not get ahead of the curve as well as we could have with the teams, just in terms of communication and inviting them into the conversation. They responded super well, which, again, is, I think at the end of the day, a lot of what you're talking about here is really, determined by the culture of the company. And what level of trust you've got, functioning in the day-to-day. But I think we definitely acknowledge that even though we have a high level of trust internally, that perception, at least, of us running ahead as a core team and pushing the projects down the road, felt to some of the teams quite broken. It felt like we were getting ahead of them and not involving them in that conversation. So we definitely had some work to do there. Like I say, we're very grateful for the culture that we have, and there was a great response. But at the same time, we had some open conversation about how that felt, and they were able to express the fact that, yeah, it didn't feel great. We'll obviously, do the work to catch up, but at the same time, if we could do it differently, we would love to have been involved in the process sooner.
Mm. And is that just mainly for them to get an understanding of the changes, or to be a part of the changes, or what do you think was driving that?
Well, I think one of the things that we maybe didn't have clear understanding around, and it was interesting because obviously hearing Daryl speak earlier, we had a brief conversation with her, I know at one point as well, about that data migration, data management. I think maybe to a degree it was actually even my misunderstanding. I didn't recognize as much clarity around the reality of the fact that our SKUs are considered data, setting up the product line is considered data. I guess in my head, I'm always thinking about, okay, we're migrating one database to another. That's data migration in my head. But yeah, data being literally that config data, and what conversations and energy was needed from a couple of different teams, specifically our purchasing team, just around looking at current state and saying, hey, in the new retail solution, do we want to make changes around how our products are listed? Do we want to make changes around the categories, all of that type of stuff? Those conversations were actually quite weighty, and it felt to those teams like they were rushed to move through that process. And I think that's the main thing. It was more that we weren't, by not including them early, we weren't actually able to have a successful resource management conversation and actually identify ahead of time where those teams would need potential backfill, or at the very least just identify where or what the requirement would be for those teams as we got closer to those conversations. And I think they just felt the overload of work. Obviously most of them are doing a day-to-day operation and work, and then we basically lumped this extra layer of requirement on top of their day, and they certainly felt the weight of that. And that was, I think, really where most of that came from. It was like, hey, if we'd known better what we were walking towards, we would have been able to calculate better for our teams and not feel like we were just, tasked with basically double duty.
Yeah, it's good feedback, and kind of tying it all together too. Bringing the data discussion back to change management. That's a good topic for sure.
Yeah.
Honestly, I find that data is usually at the root of about half of the problems that you have. And it just seems like it might be change management, or seems like it might be resource allocation. But in the end, if you really look at it, you can trace it back to some sort of data problem or some data wrinkle or an overlooked item.
Yeah. So I sense that Daryl and I are about to get into a brawl over whether data or change management is more important. I totally disagree with you, Daryl. I think it all comes back to change management.
No, it's all to do with the budget. Oh, sorry. I was
all right, budget, the time. Yeah. All right, well, good. Well, thanks for that feedback. And, I think one thing we've seen with a lot of clients is if you ask them that same question before a transformation, then you ask them after. It's always interesting to hear kind of the expectations or what they think is going to be the magnitude of difficulty with change versus after the fact. And with hindsight, what are our lessons and what can we do differently on the next phases? Usually those are two different, very different responses. So it's good to hear some of the battle wounds that you guys have had so far. All right. So when we talk about organizational change, it's a pretty broad term. Again, a lot of different meetings. You could ask 10 different people what change management means. You might get 10 different answers. And just to simplify to us, change management is anything that prepares people for the transformation and drives the actual transformational performance. So that statement alone is also broad, but it kind of helps us ground it a little bit in terms of why we do change management. We're not doing change management just to make people feel good necessarily, doing them ready and ultimately to derive our performance. And really to minimize the disruption at the time of go live is step one. And then step two is how do we accelerate our improvements, our process improvements and other capabilities that we expect to get from the system, but we're not going to get on day one. So there's another slide that isn't in this deck that we often use in other presentations. It's kind of that J curve where right after go live, your productivity drops a bit typically. And then over time, as people get more comfortable and as you fine tune things, that your performance bounces back up beyond where your performance was below. So the whole key is how do we minimize that drop after go live and then accelerate the recovery into post go live transformational performance. So we'll get into the details of what exactly that means. You know, what are the different components and tactics and strategies we can use to accomplish that? So, you know, when we think back to when we just step back and look at why change management is so difficult, why it's so important to these projects, and Rob, you kind of alluded to some of this in your description or definition of what you guys had experienced in your POS rollout, is that, you know, people are comfortable with what they know. And so whether the future state is better or not, in a lot of ways doesn't matter. The fact is that they're just comfortable with what they know, and you're changing that. And that's just the fact of the matter that we have to get used to. And the forced initiatives make them question things, or the perceived forced initiatives make them question things like, you know, what's my job going to look like? What are my roles and tasks? Do I have the right team in place, the right skills? And so those two first bullets are really important because it, you know, as project practitioners or transformational change practitioners, it makes sense to us that the change makes sense. And we may have all the reasons in the world, a great business case. The employees themselves may be telling us that they're excited for the change because we're so tired of this old system or all the inefficiencies that go along with it. But the fact of the matter is, when the rubber meets the road and we ask them to change and to give up that spreadsheet or database that they've been using for 20 years or that transaction code that they've memorized over the last 20 years in the legacy system, it's just become scary for people. And whether they want to admit it up front or not, or whether they know enough to admit it up front or not, is a different story. So people will change for their own personal reasons. You know, first of all, they have to buy in and believe in the direction that we're going. And that's the first step. That alone won't solve all the problems, but it's a prerequisite to getting them to change. They will follow orders from leaders in some cases. If the higher ups are saying this is what we're doing, then they'll do it. But if the higher ups aren't saying that this is important or that, you know, this is a key initiative, then they prioritize accordingly. Others will trust peers who are on board, and they'll follow influencers within the organization that are more informal influencers. Some people are just excited to learn something new. Others want to solve the problems. Others want challenges and just different types of jobs. Others want, you know, some sort of compensation or reward for changing. So really just understanding what in your culture really drives people's behavior. But even on a personal, individual, work group level, that could vary across the same organization. So really just understanding the psychology of it becomes pretty important. And so when we look at the common people challenges, you know, oftentimes what we see is that at the tip of the iceberg, think of the top of the graph here is the tip of the iceberg, where we're looking at on the horizon here, and we're looking for that intentional resistance. We're asking people, are you on board? And we're looking for the people that are saying, no, we're not on board. We don't want to do it. Chances are there's not a lot of people like that within your organization. Chances are that even, you know, when they're talking amongst themselves, they don't feel that. You certainly run into it. Every organization has some resistors and some people that are intentionally trying to sabotage the project, or they just are digging in their heels really hard because they just don't want to change. And, you know, that behavior can spread like a cancer if it's not mitigated. So our change management strategies do have to address it, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Usually the real challenges with change underlie the surface or below the surface. And those are the three boxes you see below intentional resistance. So first is that unintentional resistance, where, you know, this is really widespread, where, you know, people are on board. They're not trying to sabotage the project. They want this project to go well, but as it relates to them personally, they feel like they're losing something. There's a loss here. There's some insecurity. There's just being scared. I think, I'm sorry, I forgot if that was Krishnan or Venki that mentioned that early on, that the people being scared of the new jobs. And that's a really common form of resistance that you probably don't see going into the project, but as the transformation evolves and continues, we see more and more of that. There's also misunderstanding. We just don't understand what this all means. We're on board with the idea of the project, but we don't understand the future state processes or what our roles are supposed to be, any of that stuff. So really, the better we can create awareness and understanding of what the changes are and what it means to them personally, the better off we're going to be. And then finally, we talked yesterday about misalignment. You know, if people internally are misaligned, the people, processes, technology don't align in some way. What we're doing here with this transformation is inconsistent with what higher ups are saying our goals and objectives for the company are, or what our priorities are. That's where I hate to even call it resistance to change comes in, because it's not resistance to change. It's just that they don't ever get on board with the change, and they can't get on board with the change because it's misaligned with other conflicting priorities or conflicting directives or visions that might be laid out by the organization. So really, look, you know, when we think about why would people not change, you know, a lot of times we, you know, as consultants, I make this mistake often, quite candidly. I'll ask the question or frame the problem in terms of a resistance to change. And even on the slide, you see I use the word resistance a few times here, but really it's not resistance to change, because that suggests that people are consciously choosing to resist. The bigger problem is they're not getting on board, and they're not aligned with the direction and fully supporting that, not because they don't want to, but because they don't understand it. They're misaligned. They're not incentivized to do it. It's not a priority for them because they haven't been told it is, that sort of thing. So that's the real organizational change issues we have to deal with. So just some common myths to think about with change management. First of all, as change management, oftentimes people think of it as it's just training and communications. And I'm going to show you a slide here in a second that looks at the SureStep methodology and kind of not validates, but it supports this comment or this belief that OCM is typically focused on training and communications. There's a lot more to it than that. Training and communications is really important, but I would consider that kind of an ante just to get the change to stick. The minimum level of effort you would need is that training communications. New technology equals transformation. A lot of times people think we're implementing D365. It's a great revolutionary product, which it is, but that doesn't mean it's going to change your business on its own. So we've got to figure out how change management can link the new technical capabilities to actual performance and people change. And then the third myth is that consultants can just come in and run the actual change. And that's not true either. You need to own that change internally. You can lean on consultants like us to help facilitate the process and help you do a lot of the heavy lifting. But at the end of the day, you guys have to own it, and it has to be owned by not just those of you on the phone here either. It needs to be, more importantly, people that aren't on the phone here today that are part of the business and key stakeholders and influencers within the organization. So these are just a few of the guiding principles when we think about what makes change succeed. You want to involve as many people as you can to create ownership, as I just mentioned. You want to drive change as much as you can, both from the top down and bottom up. And a lot of that balance is going to depend on your culture. If you're a hierarchical, top down, command and control type of company, that's not necessarily a bad thing, even though it's not. Generally, it's there's myths out there that everyone should be a bottoms-up democracy. Some companies don't find that to be appropriate for them, so they're more of a top-down type of organization. So you need a certain amount of that too, just to drive the overall direction and vision. But you also need that bottoms-up involvement too, and that's an important part of it. You want to customize change plan. I'm really leery of any sort of canned, off-the-shelf, quote-unquote, best practice, because I think every single solution in this whole transformation space needs to be tailored for an organization. There's certain best practices and things you can leverage from outside experts, but ultimately those outside experts need to be tailoring those solutions for who you are as an organization. Measuring effectiveness throughout is very important. Accentuating change-related data specific to the affected is important as well. So making sure that we're tracking how the people are being affected and what their perceptions are. Driving buy-in, et cetera, and I'll let you read through the rest of these here. But those are some of the guiding principles that drive the more successful change management projects we've been involved with. So when we look at the sure step methodology, and I'm going to assume that at least a few of you here in the session are using sure step or some variation of sure step or bits and pieces of it. I know, one thing I've noticed about the Microsoft ecosystem is that, I think I mentioned this yesterday, the vendors and VARs and system integrators out there are wildly inconsistent in their use of sure step, and they have different interpretations of it, different levels of adoption of it. So it's highly inconsistent. And I suspect if I looked at each of your plans, each of the organizations on the phone here today, I'm probably going to see very different, adoptions of this. But regardless, we look at this as a baseline of this is kind of Microsoft's definition of what sure step is at a high level. And I know this is an eyesore, difficult to read. Many of you have probably seen this before, or a variation of the slide. But what I want to highlight is that, you look at just visually, where the focus is. The focus is up here on all this solution-ish type stuff. It's all the, building, designing, building, configuring, testing the software. That clearly is where a bulk of the effort is. And that's understandable because this is coming from the lens of Microsoft and the Microsoft partners that you're working with in your implementation. The problem is if you look at the grand scheme of things in terms of what really drives the success or failure of your project, it's usually not this stuff up here, the top 2/3 of the screen, if you can see my mouse moving there. Down here is almost a footnote. You see something called Organizational Change Management Library. And this is where you have, I'm trying to actually read it myself, leadership alignment, stakeholder engagement, organizational, looks like organization excellence, or I have terrible eyesight, so that's difficult to read. But it's just very broad and vague kind of change management buzzwords thrown in here. And it kind of fits, what we see most VARs and system integrators in the Microsoft space do in terms of some of the change management. Is generally it just comes down to, let's just train the people and put out some communications about why we're doing this project. And even that largely falls on you, the implementing company, your responsibility. So the whole idea here is that when we look at this slide and this framework, we see that there's a lot missing, even if we just take at face value these footnotes that are down here in that third row from the bottom with the colored chevrons there. There's a lot of things missing, like organizational design, how are roles and responsibilities going to look? If we're moving to a shared services model of any sort, what's that going to look like? What's the org design? What's the operating model? That sort of stuff, we're not talking about that here with SureStep. That's kind of assumed that you know that already. And that's where companies get into trouble, is that they don't know that already. And they're leaning on their system integrator to help define that. But the system integrator is leaning on the client to tell them how to configure the software. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem, which is why that implementation readiness piece that we talked about yesterday is so critical. The standardized and common business processes is another one. A lot of times companies get hung up spending a lot of time, as they should, on figuring out how are we going to standardize and create these common processes across the organization. And the problem is if you do that while your system integrator is waiting for you to tell them how to build the software, the meter's running while you're making that decision. And usually are either going to get forced into a bad decision or a quick premature decision because you don't have the time or the budget to waste or let the meter keep running while you're debating that. Or you take your time, get the decision right, and the meter runs and the project goes over budget. Before you've ever started, you're trending over budget. So those are the things we have to think about in terms of when we make these decisions, when we engage the system integrator. Change impact, building skills and competencies, communication plans, materials, all that stuff. Those are just a few of the things that are missing from the SureStep methodology. You want to make sure you augment with the expertise you need to make it possible. So these next few minutes, I'll talk about change management toolset and just walk through what the different tool sets are that we would typically use here. And first of all, just starting from more of a sequential view of change management, there's two things that are oftentimes or should be inputs into your change strategy. First is your change readiness assessment in terms of how people are ready for the change, and really just looking deep below the surface to understand what are those likely pockets of resistance that they may not be manifesting themselves yet in terms of some sort of blatant resistance to the change. But we know based on experience and based on other companies that those behaviors or patterns that we're seeing in this organization are very likely or extremely likely likely to evolve into resistance to change later on as the project continues. I'll give you an example. A lot of times when we do organizational assessments, we find that one of the common perceptions is that the company doesn't do enough top-down communication, and they don't have employees don't have a clear sense of what the direction of the company is. So that in and of itself, you think, well, what does that have to do with my D365 deployment? And it has a lot to do with it, because when you start to deploy the changes, people start to question what does this mean? Why are we doing this? Why are you changing my job? And again, it's not that they want to be a pain to work with, but it's typically because they don't understand. So that's an example of something where if we see that in a situation like that, we see that a client is perceived that way as not having enough clear vision and communication from the top. Part of our change strategy might be to build more communications and build more top-down vehicles and ways of reaching the masses as it relates to this project, so it clearly ties back to the vision. Now, that's something you should probably do anyway, but for a company that has that challenge, they want to do even more of it. So we're going to typically beef up that portion of the change strategy. Now, the second part is that vision for change. Why are we changing? What is that to be future state? What are we evolving toward? Are we trying to improve our customer experience? Are we trying to be more efficient? Are we trying to become more of a global unified company? And how does that relate to this project? And it gets back to that whole strategy articulation that we talked about yesterday. So those two things combined then lead into your change strategy in terms of how we're going to tailor our change strategy plan and tactics to fit the unique situation that you're all in. So that's where we get into leadership alignment, skills and competencies, communications, and all the different levers we can pull within change management. We're going to talk more about these one by one as we go here, but these boxes on the right just give you a preview of some of those different activities that we want to be looking at. And along the way, we're continuing to monitor through surveys and focus groups. We're monitoring how the needle is moving in terms of managing the change, and also where the unexpected new points of resistance are coming from. And one of the things whenever I'm talking about change management and managing change throughout a project, I always use the analogy of the old whack-a-mole arcade games where you used to, and I think they are still around, but I don't play video games anymore, so I don't know. But the ones where you've got the big hammer, the foam hammer, you've got to beat down the moles, and every time you hit one, a new one pops up. It's kind of like change management. There's always something new that's popping up, or a new form of resistance that maybe hadn't been uncovered before. Maybe you did uncover it, but it's manifesting itself more extreme than we thought. Those are the things you want to do to monitor those changes throughout the transformation. So when we talk to organizations about their change management objectives, these are some of the things that we're typically seeing and hearing. Some of the themes we see and hear in terms of what we want our change program to accomplish. Now, this isn't one size fits all. Maybe most of these apply to you, some of them maybe don't. But we really need to understand, what is it we want to accomplish with our change management program? Is it just simply communicate to people so they better understand? Is it to really help them understand these new processes, which would include D365, but might also include other non-D365 types of processes? How do performance measures fit into it? How are we going to build centers of excellence to support D365 longer term? These are all the types of things objectives we want to define early on, so we know what it is we're trying to accomplish with this program. So just to run quickly through the change management tool set and some of the things that we typically use, and we've included some screenshot samples of things that we typically use with our clients. The first is that organizational change readiness survey and analysis. And that's that piece I was starting to mention a few minutes ago about looking below the surface to understand what is likely to turn into resistance to change or be an obstacle to change later on. And a lot of times, it's a good way to think about this, by the way, is not thinking about employees resisting change, but thinking about it more of as an obstacle to them changing. It may not be them personally that's creating the obstacle, but there's some kind of organizational obstacle that we've got to address to help them move along. If we focus too much on the individual, I think what happens is you think, okay, well, that person seems like they want to change, and so therefore they probably will. It a lot of times doesn't matter how much they want to change. It's a matter of, can they change in the current environment. So we want to identify what those environmental obstacles are. We want to measure the severity and root cause of the resistance, focus on enabling broad transformation capabilities, areas that we want to focus in developing the organizational change strategy and plan. So that change readiness survey, the focus groups we do early on to assess the current landscape should be a very important input into the change strategy and plan that we put together. And as I mentioned before, these should be conducted early and iteratively throughout the transformation. Now, excuse me, typically what we do, as I mentioned, the organizational readiness surveys we typically do, usually that's an online survey that we distribute. We have a starting point that we use to start with our clients, but we always tailor it based on who the client is and what the priorities are for them. Then we use that survey to then create a series of questions. We'll ask a series of focus groups just to get more qualitative information to augment the surveys. And then from that, in this middle box here on the right side, we come up with an analysis of the readiness of using the level of readiness, looking at change through a number of different lenses like, culture, organizational clarity, alignment, training, accountability, et cetera. So, and what you do here is you identify the areas where you're strong. Usually most companies have a handful that they're pretty solid on, at least for the time being, based on where they are in the project. And then you have other areas that are red, that are kind of high priority areas, and then you've got some yellows that are kind of neutral. And so when you build a change management plan, obviously you want to start tackling those reds as soon as you can, and time, budget, and resource permitting, you might start getting into some of those yellows just to get ahead of them as much as you can. So we tailor that plan based on the results. And then typically, within each of those line items, you have some analysis of what the risks are, what the strengths are, what the recommended next steps and action items are to build into the change plan. Change management should also include communication. So this is the part where we create a tailored communications plan, again, largely based on what we learn in that assessment, the organizational readiness assessment. Here's where we look at the qualitative comments and themes that we hear in the focus groups to build a communication plan that is tailored to not only the organization as a whole, but also targeting different parts of the organization based on where we see more of the issues or needs for each of those parts of the organization. Just to give you an example, a lot of times we have clients that have trouble dealing with their sales teams, or their sales teams have trouble with transformations like these. And in fact, a few of us, third stage, were with a client last night for dinner, and we were talking about this exact topic, how a lot of times your sales team now is expected with Microsoft CRM or whatever CRM system you're using with D365, you're expecting them now to do stuff that they didn't used to have to do as far as capturing lead and prospect and sales pipeline type of information. And there's really, it's harder to sell it to them in terms of an individual benefit, because to them, it's just time taken away from them being able to make calls or interact with prospects and close more deals and generate more revenue and commission for themselves. So a lot of times sales groups are really hard to change because it's just, they have different motives. ERP affects them differently than most people. And it's usually perceived as a pretty significant negative to sales teams. So the communication plan for them within an organization is going to look a lot different than the communications you might have to your customer service group, your finance group, some of the people that have different motives or different tolerances for change. So whole idea here is you want to tailor it for who you are as an organization and what we find in the assessment. Organizational design and looking at more the pragmatic part of who's going to do what and what's this organization going to look like post D365. That's really important. A lot of companies don't really think about that. They think, okay, well, D365 is going to, for example, offer up predictive analytics and some machine learning that will allow us to automate some of this manual process that we spend time going to dig up information. And that's great. So it frees up, let's say it frees up 60 or 70% of Joe's time. We have to define what Joe's going to do with the rest of his time now. That 60 or 70% of his time that he used to spend gathering information and looking at multiple systems and picking people's brains to get that data. And by the way, now Joe's scared because you're telling him that D365 and machine learning and robots or whatever else are going to do his job for him. So he's going to be especially fearful of this change once we get down to it. So we've got to define what Joe's going to do, not only so we have a clear vision for the organizational design, but also so we can articulate to him clearly why he shouldn't be worried and why, what his role is going to look like, assuming, Joe still has a job afterwards. And that's, if not, that's another conversation or another direction you go with the change strategy and the org design. But those are the kind of discussions you want to be having early on so that by the time you go live, you're not trying to figure out who's on first, who's on second. You've got that figured out, and we understand what our expectations are and how the business processes and the technology fit into that org design.
Yeah, one quick question here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, the point is, at what point that Joe knows that his job, or the two questions on this. One is, at what state of the project that do we know that Joe's not going to have any work for 80% of his time a day? Is it at the very beginning when we are thinking about the to-be process, or is it when we are rolling out the implementation and finding out that the tool is providing certain things, and now Joe doesn't have to do those stuff at all anymore? At what point, from your experience, do you think it comes up to a light that such things there? Number one. Number two, what is the responsibility of the consultants in terms of helping the customer identifying these? And is it the responsibility of the consultant to find out what Joe will be doing, or is it left up to the customer or the users, organizations to decide that?
Sure. Yeah, my experience has been that for most SIs and VARs, not just in the D365 world, but in SAP and Oracle as well, is that the consultants, the D365 consultants and VARs are more interested in understanding what Joe's process is going to be, so that they can build that into the system, and what his user security profile needs to look like, so they can build that into the system. So they're sort of touching on Joe's role, but not from the perspective of how exactly is his job going to look, and what's his job going to look like outside of D365. So to answer your question, consultants don't usually do that unless you have a change consultant that's focused on it. But the best time to do it, I think, is when you're defining the to-be processes as a first pass, or at least a high-level view of how Joe's job is going to change. And then certainly when you get into user acceptance testing or the conference room pilots, you'll start to identify more changes and more, working out more of the kinks or ironing out the wrinkles of how Joe's job is going to change. So it's iterative, but ideally it starts when you're defining the to-be state. The problem with the to-be state is generally, if your D365 consultants are driving it, they're trying to get at, what do I need to know about the process to be able to build the software? They're not thinking about it from, what do I need to do to understand what Joe's going to do and what his job's going to look like and how I'm going to help him through the change. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Okay, does that help, or any other question there?
It does. Thank you.
Sure.
Maybe I spoke in mute. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. And then I think the last slide for this portion is the benefits realization. So a lot of times companies will have a business case to justify the project, and then they get the approval for the project, put it on the shelf, and move forward. Or worse yet, a lot of companies will say, we don't need a business case because we know we have to do this either way, because our system is about to be sunset or faded out. And you're seeing more and more of that, where they don't want to spend the time to build a business case because they don't need it, or they don't think they need it. The problem is, I think most of the value of a business case is to help manage direction of the project and governance behind the project, so you know that any decisions you make are driving some sort of bigger business benefits that it's expected. And also it helps you drive performance after go live, so we can go back and look and say, okay, where are we achieving the benefits and where are we not achieving the benefits we expect, and why, and what's the root cause, and how can we tweak that and optimize that. We can't do that without a business case, or at least some sort of definition of what our target performance measures are. So I think that's a way to reframe the way people typically think about business cases, but unfortunately, most companies don't think a lot about that, because they're usually under the gun to move quickly for some reason. There's something driving them to move pretty quickly, but you want to not lose sight of that bigger picture goal of what you're trying to accomplish. So when does change management occur in a D365 transformation? We've talked a lot about a lot of different things here. When we're helping companies define their D365 strategy and plan, and these are some of the activities that fall within that, which includes activities related to how you select software and how you arrived at this decision to move forward with D365. There's a lot of things you have done to get to this point. And even before you've selected D365, ideally you would have started organizational change management in the form of readiness assessments and understanding the magnitude of change so that you can plan accordingly and have an implementation strategy and plan that feeds into that. But if you haven't, these are some of the things you want to think about making sure you do. And so the second work stream here with change management are things that you would normally start on even before you move forward with the D365 implementation. And then once you do select D365, this is a slide we reviewed yesterday when we were talking about implementation readiness. This middle work stream around people is all the stuff that you would typically need to be doing or should be doing after you've picked D365, but before you start fully moving ahead at full speed with designing and building the software. So the short answer is it should happen as soon as possible, and chances are, no matter when you started, it's not early enough. I have yet to meet a client who regrets starting change management too early. Usually they started too late or they didn't do enough. In fact, I don't know that I've met any client that's ever said, yeah, we were pretty good on change management. We wouldn't do a thing differently. That was the easy part of the implementation. I literally don't ever hear that. So something to be aware of. It's probably going to be a lot harder than you think. Unless you've been through this multiple times before, then you probably have a decent understanding of how hard it'll be. And then, I showed this slide yesterday too, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but this is where it shows how business processes feed into organizational change management. So when we're defining those change impacts, and actually I think this helps answer the question of when do we define Joe's job? As we're defining that future state here, you see at the bottom middle box here, identifying change impacts. So this is where we're looking at Joe's job. How is he affected? What's his job going to look like? What's the org design? And then how are we going to build a plan to help Joe and his team through the transformation? So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the case studies, but I'll just show you what's here. So when you get the link to the PowerPoint presentations, you'll know what you're seeing here. There's, I think, 3 different case studies here that just talk about different ERP projects and some of the challenges they faced, and then how change management was used to fix those challenges. And these are not just D365 related, these are broader ERP based case studies, but they're very relevant to D365 or any other sort of digital transformation or ERP project. So I think you'll have 3 of those there that tell you the industry and everything. So that puts us right at almost to the time where we need to be. What questions do you have about change management in general and general frameworks that we've talked about so far? Okay. Well, what I'm going to do here, we're going to go on mute here for about probably 60 seconds just while we transition. Your screen's going to go blank, but we'll switch over here. I'm going to pull up the other presentation, shift over to Marcus, and then we'll get going here in about 60 seconds. So just hang tight for 1 second.